Welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be exploring something today that should be right up your alley as a philosopher, I think. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into constitutionalism.
Ah, yes, an area ripe for philosophical examination for sure. When we talk about constitutionalism, we really are talking about the very essence of power, aren't we? Its limits, and how we balance individual freedom with how we govern ourselves collectively. It's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And to help us explore this really complex idea, we're going to be looking at excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on constitutionalism.
Ah, yes, the Stanford Encyclopedia. Always a good starting point, I'd say, for a deep dive like this.
Always. So I guess we should start with the basics. What exactly is constitutionalism?
Well, at its core, constitutionalism is this idea that government power, like any power really, should be limited. And it should be defined by a set of fundamental rules. And we call that a constitution. So it's really rejecting this idea that someone can have unchecked authority. Instead, it's trying to create a framework for how we govern, where those who govern us are both empowered, given the ability to do certain things, but also constrained. They can't just do anything they want.
So it's not just like having rules for the sake of having rules. It's about the nature of those rules themselves, right?
Yeah.
And how those rules shape the relationship between the people who are being governed and those who are actually governing.
Exactly. And legal and political philosophers, well, they've been grappling with this idea for centuries. It seems kind of paradoxical. How do you have limited government? Take Hobbes, for instance. He famously argued for, absolute sovereignty, the Leviathan, no limits.
Right. So Hobbes thought that if you tried to put any limits on a sovereign's power, then that's a recipe for disaster. It's just going to lead to chaos.
Exactly. And later you have legal theorists like John Austin, and he kind of echoed this view. He said the idea of a sovereign being bound by law, by rules, is a contradiction in terms. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it does seem counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
If a sovereign, like a king or a queen, is the one who makes the laws, how can they be bound by those same laws at the same time? It's a puzzle.
That's right. And this is where I think the source material makes a really important distinction. And honestly, I think this will probably resonate with you given your background as a philosopher. They distinguish between sovereignty and government. Two different things.
Oh, interesting. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So in, modern constitutional democracies, the people are considered the ultimate sovereign. They're the source of all political power. But the government, right, the people who are actually, acting on behalf of the people, they are subject to limitations.
Ah, I see. So it's kind of like almost like a principal-agent relationship, maybe? Like the people are the principal. They're delegating power to the government, the agent, but they're doing so with specific instructions and boundaries. You can do this, but you can't do that.
That's a great analogy. I like that. And this is where this idea of entrenchment comes in. It becomes really, really central to how constitutionalism works. Because for those limits on government power to really mean anything, they have to be firmly set. It can't be easy to change them.
Now, when we talk about entrenchment, that can manifest itself in a whole bunch of different ways, right? I mean, you see things like supermajority requirements where you need more than a simple majority to change the Constitution, or special legislative procedures. Sometimes you even have direct appeals to the people through referendums.
Right, exactly. The actual mechanisms, the way they do it, can be all over the place.
Yeah.
But the idea, the principle behind it is the same. You're trying to protect the Constitution, these fundamental rules, from being too easily changed. And especially by the people in power, because, they might be tempted to just change the rules to benefit themselves.
Yeah, good point. And this brings up such a fascinating question from a philosophical perspective. I mean, if the people are the ultimate sovereign, like we were saying, and they created the Constitution in the first place,
Yeah.
couldn't they also just undo it? Or just change it on a whim whenever they want? I mean, where does the obligation come from?
Yeah, that's a question that's kept legal and political philosophers busy for a long, long time. It gets to the heart of self-binding, Can you really bind yourself? And it makes you think about the limits of popular sovereignty, how far does it go? And it also highlights this tension that always exists between, keeping things stable, having a stable constitution, and also being responsive to what people want, to democracy.
Deep stuff. It's funny, when we think of constitutions, we often think of this grand, single document,
Yeah.
like the U.S. Constitution, right? Something you can hold in your hands. But not all constitutions are like that, are they? Some are unwritten. They evolve over time through, traditions, precedent, just how things have always been done.
That's a great point. And the United Kingdom is probably the classic example of this. They have important documents, obviously, like the Magna Carta, which had a huge impact, but they don't have one single written constitution. It's more like, well, it comes from all sorts of places.
And I mean, for someone coming from, a philosophy background like yourself, where you think about systems of rules and principles all the time, it really makes you wonder. I mean, can unwritten rules really have the same weight as written ones? Can they be as clear? Can they provide the same stability?
That's the million-dollar question. And people are still debating that to this day. There are definitely arguments on both sides. I mean, some people say that unwritten constitutions, well, they're more flexible, they can adapt more easily. But others worry that they're just too vague, and they could be more open to manipulation because it's not all written down in black and white.
Right. It's like a trade-off, isn't it? You're trying to balance adaptability with certainty. Okay, so let's bring in one of the big names in political philosophy here, Montesquieu. Now, he's probably best known for his idea of the separation of powers, which is, central to how many constitutional systems are designed.
Oh, absolutely. Montesquieu was brilliant. He really saw the danger of concentrating too much power in one place. And he really pushed for this idea that you have to divide governmental authority, right? You have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Keep them separate.
Exactly. And the idea is that this division creates checks and balances, so no one branch can become too powerful and tyrannical, kind of like that old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right. And this idea of separating powers raises another really important question for constitutionalism. How do you make sure that this separation is real? I mean, how do you make sure each branch is actually independent and can act as a check on the others?
Which brings us to the role of the judiciary. I mean, is an independent judiciary essential? Can you have effective constitutionalism without a court system that can review what the other branches are doing and say, hey, wait a minute, that's unconstitutional?
That's a huge question and one that's at the heart of so many debates about constitutionalism. Some people say that judicial review, that's the power of the courts to invalidate laws that they think violate the Constitution, is absolutely essential. You can't have constitutionalism without it.
Because otherwise, the other branches, the legislature or the executive, could just ignore the limits placed on them by the Constitution. There would be no one to hold them accountable.
That's right. But of course, not everyone agrees. There are plenty of people who are critical of judicial review. And their main concern is, democracy. They say, look, these judges aren't elected. Why should they have the final say on what's constitutional or not? That should be up to the people, or at least to the people's elected representatives.
Yeah, so you have this tension between, upholding constitutional principles, these fundamental rules, and also respecting the will of the people as it's expressed through their elected representatives. Like, whose voice should matter more? It's a classic philosophical dilemma, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And it's also important to remember that alongside all these formal institutions and written rules that we've been talking about, constitutionalism also relies on things that aren't written down anywhere. Norms and conventions, just how things have always been done.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We touched upon this before with unwritten constitutions. But even in countries with a formal written constitution, these conventions still play a role. They got to fill in the gaps, right?
Exactly. And there's a famous legal scholar, A.V. Dicey, who called these constitutional conventions. He said they're like these rules of political conduct. They're not legally enforceable, like you can't take someone to court for violating them. But everyone in power, they just kind of know that they're supposed to follow them. It's like an unspoken agreement.
It's amazing how powerful these unwritten rules can be. It makes me think, I wonder if there are similar types of conventions in other fields, too, like in philosophy, for example. Are there unwritten rules or traditions that shape how philosophers do their work, even if they're not, like, officially written down anywhere?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, it makes you wonder, right? Maybe certain schools of thought, different philosophical traditions, maybe they operate according to these unwritten rules, like they guide how you construct an argument, how you evaluate evidence, how you come to your conclusions.
Yeah, almost like a hidden constitution of philosophical discourse.
Exactly. I love that. And it really makes you think that maybe this idea of constitutionalism, of limiting and structuring power, it goes beyond just, formal governments and legal systems. Maybe it's something that's more fundamental to how humans organize themselves, even in areas like philosophy.
Really fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've laid some good groundwork here. We've explored what constitutionalism is, its different forms, and some of the philosophical questions it raises. But I think now we need to turn to what is probably the most controversial and intellectually stimulating aspect of this whole thing, interpretation.
Ah, yes. This is where it gets really interesting and where the debates get heated. It's all about hermeneutics, isn't it?
Hmm.
How do you understand and apply the principles that are laid out in a constitution?
Exactly. And it's not always easy, especially when you're dealing with a document that was written, you know, maybe hundreds of years ago in a totally different social and political context. Like, how do you apply those ideas to today's world?
Right, and this is where you get the big debate between originalism and living constitutionalism. Two very different approaches to understanding what a constitution means and what its purpose is.
Two very different camps, for sure.
So you have the originalists, and as you might guess from the name, they believe that the key is staying true to the original meaning of the text. They say we should interpret the Constitution according to how the people who wrote it and ratified it understood it back then.
So they're like historical detectives.
Hmm.
They're trying to figure out what the framers intended, what they were thinking by looking at historical records, the debates they had, and the whole context in which the Constitution was written.
Exactly. And for them, the meaning of the Constitution, it's fixed. It's anchored in the past. It doesn't change.
Okay, I get that. But then you have the living constitutionalists, right?
Yeah.
And they have a very different view. They think the Constitution should be interpreted in a way that keeps up with the times. It should adapt to modern circumstances and values.
That's right. They put a lot of emphasis on how societies change, how they evolve. And they say that for a constitution to stay relevant, it needs to change along with society. It can't be stuck in the past. In fact, they often use this phrase, the dead hand of the past. They say we shouldn't be bound by the choices of people who are long gone, especially when those choices, might have been based on assumptions or prejudices that we just don't accept anymore today.
Right, right. So it's like, how much weight do you give to the historical context versus, what people value and need in the present day? It's about balancing continuity with change.
Right, exactly. And it's important to remember that even within these two big camps, originalism and living constitutionalism, there's a lot of variation and nuance. People disagree about how to apply these ideas. It's a really rich and complex debate, and it's one that's occupied legal scholars, judges, and of course philosophers for decades.
Oh, for sure. Now, I know you're very familiar with all sorts of philosophical ideas. I'm curious, does this whole debate between originalism and living constitutionalism, does it connect to any other philosophical debates or theories that you've come across?
Oh, absolutely. This debate, it really echoes a lot of broader philosophical discussions, like debates about the nature of interpretation, the role of history in understanding things, the relationship between language and meaning. We could get into hermeneutics, which is all about interpretation, or the philosophy of language, even theories of history. It gets really deep.
I love it. And this is where your expertise, as a philosopher becomes so valuable. You can help us make those connections, connect these specific legal and political debates to these broader philosophical ideas and frameworks. And speaking of philosophers, I think we should introduce a thinker whose work has been really influential in how people think about constitutional interpretation. Ronald Dworkin.
Ah, Dworkin. A brilliant mind, no doubt. He was a legal philosopher, and his work, it's had a profound impact on how we think about these issues.
For sure. So Dworkin, he developed this idea of a moral reading of the Constitution. He argued that when you're interpreting the Constitution, it's not just a technical legal exercise, it's actually a moral endeavor.
That's right. He said judges shouldn't just look at the Constitution like it's a set of rules. They need to see it as an expression of deeper moral principles, the principles of a just and free society.
So it's not just about figuring out what the words mean, it's about engaging in this, like, moral reasoning process, like what interpretation best upholds these fundamental moral principles.
Exactly. Dworkin argued that judges should always try to find the interpretation that provides the best moral justification for the Constitution's provisions, even if that means going beyond, the literal words of the text.
Now, this is where your philosophical background comes in handy. I mean, how do you think a philosopher like Dworkin, with his emphasis on moral reasoning and finding the best justification, how would he approach a real-world constitutional issue? What would that look like?
That's a great question. If I had to guess, I'd say Dworkin's approach would probably involve, first of all, a very careful analysis of the specific constitutional text, the actual words. But then he'd also consider the historical context, like what was happening when those words were written. And then, really crucially, he would think about the moral principles that are at stake. And then he would try to build an interpretation that's both legally sound, it makes sense from a legal perspective, and also morally defensible, it's ethically justified. An interpretation that really reflects those core values of a free and just society.
It sounds like he's saying that interpreting the Constitution is not just a mechanical process, right? It's not like solving a math problem. It requires you to think deeply about what's right and wrong, about fairness and justice. And it requires you to find interpretations that promote those values.
That's a great way to put it. And this raises another question, which I think is a really deep one. How do we even figure out what those moral principles are? Where do they come from? Are they like universal? Or do they change from culture to culture, from society to society?
Wow, now we're really getting into some deep philosophical waters here. We're talking about the relationship between law, morality, and, the very legitimacy of political systems. This is a conversation that could go on for hours.
Absolutely. And honestly, we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this incredibly complex and fascinating topic. But before we go any further into the intricacies of constitutional interpretation, I think it's important to acknowledge something. Constitutionalism, even with all its noble goals, it's not perfect. It has its flaws, its limitations. And there are people who criticize it, who say it doesn't always live up to its promises.
Right, right. I mean, no system of government is perfect, is it? And even a system that's designed to limit power and protect rights, it can still fall short sometimes.
Exactly. And that's where these critical theories of constitutionalism come in. They offer different perspectives that challenge some of the basic assumptions that we often make about how constitutionalism works.
So they're basically questioning whether constitutionalism, as it exists in the real world, whether it actually achieves what it sets out to do, whether it really protects rights and limits power.
Exactly. Some critics argue that constitutions, even though they often sound really idealistic and high-minded, they can actually end up reinforcing existing power structures and inequalities. Instead of promoting justice, they just protect the status quo.
So instead of being a shield against tyranny, like they're supposed to be, they become tools of oppression, or at least tools for keeping things the way they are, which might not be fair to everyone.
That's one of the central criticisms for sure. And often this critique goes hand in hand with a critique of judicial review. We were talking about that before. They say, look, giving unelected judges the final say on issues of basic rights and social policy, that's just not democratic.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, who should have the final say? How do you balance the need for an independent judiciary, judges who aren't influenced by politics, with the principle of democratic accountability, the idea that the people should have a say in how they're governed?
That's right. It's a tough balance. And these concerns become even more, significant when you consider that judges, just like everyone else, they come from a particular background. They have their own experiences, their own perspectives. They're not just these neutral robots, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're human beings.
Yeah.
And every human being brings their own biases and assumptions to the table, even if they don't realize it.
Exactly. And recognizing that, recognizing that even judges are subjective, well, it's led some people to argue that we need more transparency in the judicial system and more accountability.
So, maybe we need ways to make sure that the judiciary is more diverse,
Yeah.
so that there are judges from all different walks of life with different perspectives and experiences. Or maybe we need ways to make their decisions, their reasoning, more clear and open to public scrutiny so people can understand how they're making those decisions.
Those are all great ideas, worth exploring for sure. And it's important to remember that the people who are criticizing constitutionalism, they're not necessarily saying we should get rid of it completely. Often they're actually calling for reform. They want us to think about how we can make constitutional systems more just, more equitable, more responsive to the needs of all members of society, not just a select few.
Yeah, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? It's about recognizing that even good systems can have flaws, and then trying to fix those flaws to make the system even better.
Absolutely. Constitutionalism, it's not a finished product. It's
Yeah.
like any other form of governance. It's a work in progress. It requires us to be constantly vigilant, constantly thinking critically about how it's working and being willing to adapt and change as times change.
It reminds me of something. Constitutions, they're not like, these sacred texts carved in stone. They're more like living frameworks, right?
Mhm.
They need to be interpreted, debated, and sometimes even changed to make sure they're actually serving their purpose.
I love that analogy. And that brings us back to why philosophy is so important to this whole discussion. Philosophy, it's all about those big questions of justice, morality, what makes for a good life. And those are the very questions we need to be asking when we're thinking about how to govern ourselves, how to build a just society.
Right, right. It's not enough to just understand the legal technicalities, the nuts and bolts of how the Constitution works. You also need to think about what it all means. What are the values behind it? How should we apply those values in the real world? What kind of society are we trying to create?
Exactly. At its core, constitutionalism is a moral and political project. It's about defining the values and principles that we're going to live by, as a society, and then creating a system of government that actually reflects those values.
And as we've seen, it's not always easy. It's full of challenges and contradictions. We have to grapple with tough questions. Like how do you balance individual rights with the needs of the community? How do
Yep.
you balance democracy with the need for limited government? It's messy.
It is messy, but it's also really exciting, don't you think? And it's the kind of mess that, honestly, I think philosophers are uniquely equipped to help us sort through.
Absolutely. So as we move on to the final part of our deep dive here, I want to leave our listener, our philosopher friend, with one final question to think about. A real head scratcher.
So we've been exploring, all these core concepts of constitutionalism, the different forms it takes, the philosophical puzzles it raises. It's fascinating. But now I think it's time to maybe get a little critical, don't you think? We need to look at some of the challenges and critiques that constitutionalism faces, especially the ones that come from, critical legal theory.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like any system, no matter how well-intentioned it is,
Right.
it's going to have its blind spots, right? Its limitations.
Yeah.
So what are some of the main criticisms that people have leveled at constitutionalism? What are the big problems?
Well, one of the most common criticisms, and it's a really important one, is that constitutions, even though they're often presented as these protectors of individual rights and freedoms, they can actually function as tools for maintaining the status quo. They can end up preserving existing power structures and inequalities instead of actually challenging them.
So instead of being these neutral guardians of justice, they can actually become instruments for keeping those in power and benefiting those who are already privileged.
That's exactly the point that a lot of critical legal scholars make. They argue that the very language of rights and freedoms, the way we talk about these things, it can be used in a way that kind of masks the underlying power dynamics. And it can actually end up perpetuating injustice, even though it sounds, good on the surface.
Can you give me an example of how that might actually play out in the real world? How'd that actually work?
Sure, let's take the concept of property rights. It's often seen as this fundamental individual right. You have the right to own things, to property, but the legal framework that surrounds property rights, the actual laws and rules, they can actually reinforce, historical patterns of inequality, like who gets to own what and who gets excluded.
I see. So it's on the surface, it seems like it's all about protecting individual ownership, right? But if you look deeper, you might see that it's actually contributing to these existing economic disparities, the gap between the rich and the poor, and these social hierarchies that already exist.
That's it. Critical legal scholars, they really want us to pay attention to those deeper dynamics, to see how seemingly neutral legal concepts, even ones that are enshrined in a constitution, can be used to, maintain those power structures and make inequality seem, well, normal, even natural.
It reminds me of this distinction that you often hear in political philosophy between formal equality and substantive equality. I mean,
Yeah.
formal equality, that just means everyone's treated the same under the law, right? But it doesn't take into account the fact that people might start from very different places. They might not have equal opportunities in real life.
Exactly. And critical legal theory, it's very much concerned with that gap, the gap between formal equality and substantive equality. It's saying, look, it's not enough to just say everyone's equal before the law. You have to look at the actual lived experiences of people, especially people who are marginalized or excluded.
Yeah.
You have to see if they're really able to access those rights and freedoms equally.
So it's kind of like saying that just because a law says everyone's equal, that doesn't automatically mean that everyone has an equal chance to succeed, right? If there are all these underlying social and economic inequalities, then formal equality might not actually lead to fairness in real life.
Right, you got it. And this critique of constitutionalism, it extends to the role of the judiciary, too. Courts are often seen as the guardians of constitutional rights, right? But some people argue that this power of judicial review, the power to strike down laws that judges think are unconstitutional, it can actually be undemocratic. And it can undermine the will of the people, the people who voted for those laws through their elected representatives.
Right. Right. We talked about this a bit earlier, didn't we? This tension between like sticking to the Constitution, upholding those principles, and also respecting the outcome of democratic processes, what the majority of people seem to want. It's tricky.
It really is. And critical legal scholars, they dive right into this dilemma. They ask, well, why should these unelected judges, people who haven't been chosen by the people, why should they have the ultimate power to say what the Constitution means and to invalidate laws that have been passed by, the people's representatives? That seems kind of anti-democratic, right?
Yeah, it definitely raises some questions like who gets to decide what the Constitution really means?
Yeah.
And how do you balance the need for an independent judiciary,
Yeah.
judges who can make decisions without being influenced by politics, with the idea that ultimately the people should be the ones in charge?
That's the million-dollar question. And these concerns, they become even more, I think, powerful when you consider that judges, well, they're human beings just like everyone else, right? I mean, they come from a particular background. They've had certain experiences. They have their own perspectives on the world. They're not these like objective robots who are just applying the law in some, purely neutral way.
Oh, for sure. I mean, they're people. And all people have their biases, their assumptions, whether they're aware of them or not.
That's right. And this recognition that even judges are, subjective to some extent, well, it's led to calls for greater transparency and accountability within the judiciary. Like, how do we make sure the judges are aware of their own biases? And how do we make their decision-making process, more open to public scrutiny so that people can understand why they're making the decisions they're making?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So maybe we need mechanisms to ensure that the judiciary is more, I don't know, representative of the diversity of viewpoints and experiences that exist in society, right? So that it's not just like one type of person making all the decisions. Or maybe we need ways to make the reasoning behind judicial decisions more accessible to the public so people can see, the logic and the values that are informing those decisions.
I think those are all really important things to consider. And, it's worth emphasizing that the people who are critiquing constitutionalism, they're not necessarily saying we should just get rid of it altogether. A lot of times what they're really doing is calling for reform. They're saying, hey, this system has some real problems, but let's fix those problems. Let's think about how we can make constitutionalism more just, more equitable, more responsive to the needs of everyone, not just a select few.
So it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's about saying, okay, this is a good system, but it can be better. Let's make it better.
Exactly. Constitutionalism, it's not a finished product, right? It's not like we've figured it all out. It's more like, any other form of governance. It's an ongoing project. It's a work in progress. We have to keep working on it. It requires us to be vigilant, to keep thinking critically about how it's working, how it's impacting people's lives, and to be willing to adapt and change as the world changes.
It makes me think of something. You know how people sometimes talk about constitutions, like they're these sacred texts, like they're set in stone, but really they're more like, living frameworks, aren't they? They need to be interpreted, debated, and sometimes even amended, changed,
Yeah.
to make sure that they're actually serving their purpose, that they're actually promoting justice and fairness.
I love that. That's a perfect way to put it. They're living documents evolving with us. And that brings us back to why philosophy is so important here. Philosophy at its core, it's all about those fundamental questions like what is justice? What does it mean to live a good life? What's the right way to organize a society? And those are the exact questions we need to be asking when we're thinking about how to govern ourselves, how to create a system of government that actually works for everyone.
Right, right. It's not enough to just understand the technical details of how a constitution works, the legal ins and outs. You have to think about the bigger picture, the values, the moral principles behind it. How do we actually apply those principles in the real world? What kind of society are we aiming for? What's the goal?
Exactly. Constitutionalism, it's not just a legal project, it's a moral and political project too. It's about defining those values, the principles we want to live by, and then building a system that reflects those values.
And as we've seen, it's a project that comes with a lot of challenges and contradictions. There are always going to be tensions. We have to constantly wrestle with those big questions. How do you balance individual rights with the needs of the community? How do you make sure that democracy doesn't turn into, the tyranny of the majority? How do you create a government that's both limited in its power, but also effective in doing what it needs to do? It's messy, that's for sure.
It's definitely messy, but it's also really important. And honestly, I think philosophers, they have a really important role to play here with their training and logic and ethical reasoning and thinking about these big questions. I think they can really help us sort through that mess and hopefully make some progress.
Absolutely. So as we get ready to move on to the last part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listener, the philosopher who's been following along with us, with one last question to ponder, something to really have on. So we've, really gone deep into this idea of constitutionalism. We've talked about the theory behind it, the challenges it faces in the real world, all sorts of things. But now I want to kind of turn things over to our listener, the philosopher in the room. And I want to ask, if constitutionalism, like we've been saying, is this ongoing project, this constant effort to build a more just and equitable society, what role does philosophy have to play in all of this? Where does philosophy fit in?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I think philosophy, it actually has a lot to offer here. It's not just some, abstract academic exercise.
Yeah.
It can really help us make sense of this whole constitutionalism thing. For one thing, I think philosophy helps us clarify the concepts that we're even talking about. We throw around these words all the time: rights, justice, democracy, rule of law. But what do those words actually mean? They're not as simple as they might seem. Philosophy can help us unpack those concepts, really examine what's behind them. What are the assumptions we're making? How have people interpreted them differently over time? It can get pretty complex.
Yeah, it's like you're building the foundation, right? You're providing the conceptual tools that we need to even think about these issues in a clear and rigorous way.
That's it. And once you have those tools, philosophy can also help us critically examine those values and principles that we decide to enshrine in our constitutions. We say that these are the things that are important to us. These are the values we want our society to be based on. But are they really universal values? Or do they just reflect, a particular culture or a particular moment in history? Are they even consistent with each other? I mean, sometimes those values might actually clash. Philosophy can help us ask those tough questions and challenge our own assumptions. It can make us think, wait a minute, are we sure these are the right values? Are they the best values?
So it's not just about like blindly accepting what's written in the Constitution. It's about constantly reflecting on those values, debating them, maybe even revising them as our understanding of justice and fairness evolves.
Exactly. And, philosophy, it can also help us grapple with the dilemmas and the tensions that always come up when you're trying to put these principles into practice. It's never easy, right? Like, how do you balance the rights of the individual with the needs of the community? How do you make sure that a government is powerful enough to do what it needs to do, but not so powerful that it becomes tyrannical? These are age-old questions, and philosophy has been wrestling with them for centuries. It can give us some guidance, some frameworks for thinking through these really tough trade-offs.
Yeah, it sounds like philosophy doesn't just help us understand constitutionalism, but also helps us actually improve it, right? To make it more just, more effective, more responsive to the needs of people.
That's the hope, right? Because constitutionalism, it's not like a destination, It's not like we arrive at some perfect system and then we're done. It's more like a journey. It's a constant process of refining, adapting, maybe even transforming our systems of governance to make them better, more just, more inclusive. And philosophy, it's like a compass that can help us navigate that journey.
I love that. And it really highlights the role of, the philosopher, the critical thinker. They're not just sitting on the sidelines observing. They're actively engaged in this process of shaping and reshaping our understanding of how we should govern ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think, with their training and rigorous argumentation and thinking about these abstract concepts in ethical reasoning, philosophers are really well suited to contribute to this conversation about constitutionalism. It's a conversation that we all need to be a part of, not just the lawyers and the politicians.
Well said. I mean, it's a reminder that constitutionalism, it's not just some dry technical topic. It's about real people's lives. It's about how we structure our societies, how we distribute power, how we protect rights, how we ensure justice. These are issues that affect everyone.
You got it. And, I hope our deep dive today has maybe sparked some new ideas for our listener, for that philosopher out there who's been tuning in. I hope it's encouraged them to see that there's a place for philosophical thinking in this world of constitutionalism, in this quest for a more just and equitable society.
Me too. So to our listener, to all the philosophers out there, keep thinking, keep questioning, keep challenging. Your ideas matter. And keep bringing those philosophical insights to bear on the really big questions of our time. How do we build a better world? How do we create systems of government that truly serve the people? It's a big task, but I think philosophy can help light the way. So until next time, keep those philosophical wheels turning.